Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 118 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, for Monday Gun Day, I've got Mike Ooley back in the studio. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Today, for Monday Gun Day, we're going to talk about a recent visit by Kamala Harris to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, where she was standing on the massacre there, on the deaths of the women and children and men and teachers and so on who were murdered there back in 2018. And she used that as a platform to promote gun control. And we're going to talk about that today in this fact sheet that the White House released, so-called fact sheet. But before we do that, I'm going to read just a quote here. I've got a couple quotes I want to share. The first one is from Thomas Jefferson. The second one is from John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost as a poet. So the first one from Thomas Jefferson: what country can preserve its liberties if its rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? And then second, nations grown corrupt love bondage more than liberty. And I think that second one in particular is relevant for today's discussion because we're talking about more and more ways that our government is growing tyrannical and growing to love the bondage of its own citizens more than freedom.
It's for your safety, Alex.
That's right. Anytime, it reminds me of the saying, and I don't know where this one comes from, but anytime the government says I'm here to help, that's the most concerning words you could ever hear. Just about. There's not much worse than the government that's here to help, and that's exactly what's going on here. So, like I said, Kamala Harris was in Florida at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. I think it was March 23rd, so it's been a few weeks ago now, to promote.
Of course, the Marjory Douglas High School was a mass murder conducted by
a psychopath.
Exactly. Well,
yeah.
I'm not a psychiatrist, but a mad person.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we don't want to use the name because that's oftentimes what these mass killers are seeking is notoriety. So we'll just leave it at that it was a mad person, a psychotic person, more than likely. And of course, there's a lot to learn from that massacre. But it's unfortunate that our current administration wants to use it, like I said, as a platform to promote gun control. And that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and that there was I'm not sure if it was called, I think it was a commission report. There was a massive report that was put out subsequent to the murders there. And I think there are a lot of lessons to learn in that massive report. We're not going to talk about that report today. That could take several episodes, as a matter of fact. But if I could just make a couple extraneous reports or observations, I guess, well, two things, I guess. Number one, I think Obama is where this sort of started. We always heard about this uniquely American experience in gun violence. And yet I've noticed how quiet it's been with respect to the Moscow murders that occurred over there. I think there were 120, 130, 40, I'm not sure, people killed over there in a mass murder just a few weeks ago. There was a school shooting in Finland. And I haven't heard anything in the press about, this isn't a uniquely American experience. This happens in lots of other places. You don't hear anything about, I know there's been a lot of stabbings in the news of late. We haven't heard about knife violence. So I just wanted to bring that up, as sometimes it's important to recognize what we don't hear in the propaganda press.
Yeah. Exactly. Not only is it very calculated what they do tell us and how they tell us, it's very calculated what they don't tell us.
And then when an unfortunate event happens here again, we'll hear the same thing. This this only happens here.
Mm-hmm.
And of course,
and it's
they hope you forget these other things. And of course, in Moscow, for instance, and I'm not an expert in Russian law, but I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say that it is nearly impossible for a private citizen to own a firearm in Russia.
Yeah. And of course, I've heard almost nothing about the school shooting in Finland in the mainstream news media. But to your point, Mike, that's not to say, right, that it's not a problem. That these are tragic events, and nobody wants these to happen. But it's not uniquely American. And if you look at the data adjusted per capita, the United States is on par with just about every other developed nation, no matter what the level of gun control is. But nevertheless, in the wake of a massacre, there's always a call to do something. And generally, that call to do something is not to do anything that would actually prevent the problem. It's just to trample on the rights of everyday citizens.
Well, and it's about politicians like Kamala Harris, or however you pronounce her, wherever she wants her name pronounced, Kamala. It's about politicians like that appearing to do something so that the electorate will attribute some sort of success or effort to them so that they can retain power. And it's not just Kamala Harris. It's your local yokel politician doing the same sort of thing, trying to convince you that they're doing something to improve your life, when in fact, in all likelihood, they're doing things insidiously to degrade the quality of your life. I know one of the things we were talking to before we came on. How do they do that? Kamala Harris, the good news is she's absolutely incompetent. We know what's happened at the border. She was put in charge of that.
The borders are.
Yeah. So hopefully she'll be as incompetent with this $750 million that we don't have, but that the federal government has indebted you with, and your kids and your grandkids. Hopefully she'll be as incompetent with this as she's been with other things. And the only thing we'll lose here is the $750 billion.
Yeah. And this is not just a
$1 million. I think I said billion.
Million. And this is not just a sort of a Democratic hate train. I mean, many Republicans are complicit in these things too, and not just the gun control issue. Indiana is a state with a supermajority Republican legislature, and we were the second state in the nation to have an emergency risk protection order process.
Yeah, and there were Republicans, John Cornyn from Texas, who's reportedly a leading candidate to replace Mitch McConnell as the Senate Majority Leader. He was one of the instrumental actors, a Republican, behind the underlying, I don't remember what it was called, had something to do with SAFER in it, Safer Communities Act. And he was one of the traitor Republicans who decided to get this thing passed.
So generally, yes, Republicans are better on gun issues, on the right to keep and bear arms, but not always, and often not. And so this is not just a Democrat. This is not just Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. This is left and right an issue where politicians are eager to take away our rights. And so it's an important one to make sure that you're active in your state so that you don't get one of these emergency risk protection order processes or laws passed. I think there are 21 states. It's not quite half of the states that have one of these. Like I said, Indiana was the second state to implement one. And these are often referred to as red flag laws, right? The formal term is extreme risk protection order. And of course, it sounds good that these laws are meant to protect people from extreme risk, right? Sort of like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is what Kamala Harris is operating under here to promote these things. So let's talk about that, Mike. You mentioned the $750 million that the Biden-Harris administration has allocated to promote these laws. But what they're doing is they have established under this, like I said, this Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, a gun control unit, essentially. And we don't have a lot of information about this, but remember these, we talked about these red flag laws back in episode 50 something, I believe. I don't remember the exact episode.
It was 55.
I'll link to it in the show notes, where we talked about red flag laws and that process more particularly. But if you would, Mike, go ahead and set out how do these work?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand what rights we're talking about in terms of our concern that these laws will trample upon our rights. Number one, we have the Second Amendment and firearms. But more importantly, not more importantly, but also equally importantly, folks need to think about the due process clause and due process as a right. Our Constitution in the Fifth and I think the 14th Amendment, I think it's the only place there's redundancy is with respect to due process. And essentially what that says is that an American citizen cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that's what we're talking about here, is whether or not the government or some government actor, or actually in some circumstances, just a regular private citizen can make allegations so that you're deprived of your property, a firearm, for instance, or firearms, without any due process of law. That is to say, someone simply alleges that you're a, quote, dangerous person, okay?
And here, I've pulled up the 14th Amendment here, and you'll see it says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's exactly what these red flag or emergency risk protection orders do.
Yeah, and what's due process of law? I mean, we're entitled to an unbiased tribunal, whether that be a judge or a jury. We're entitled to notice of whatever action the government is going to take against us, so that we can retain counsel, line up witnesses, so that we can present evidence, so that we can know the evidence that the government has against us, so that we can cross-examine these folks that are saying that we're purportedly dangerous. And we have a right that the decisions be made exclusively on the evidence that's put into, I'm using another term, that's put into evidence during that judicial process, whether it be a jury trial or in this case, it would be without a jury, a judge. And then we're also entitled to an attorney and that a record be established. So if that judge makes a mistake, there can be another tribunal and even another tribunal that can look at that record and see what happened and say, hey, no, that's out of bounds. Rights were deprived, or that was a bad mistake. And then we also have the right to require that the tribunal, the judge, make specific factual and legal findings as to why he or she is going to do what they're going to do. And that's so not only the public can know, but those intermediate appellate courts, or even a Supreme Court in a state, or even at the United States level, can look at what's gone on in terms of depriving somebody of their rights and whether it was appropriate or not.
And so all these things that you've mentioned are components of due process. Mm-hmm. And as we said, the 5th and the 14th Amendment say that you shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's exactly what these red flag laws don't do. They take away your property without due process until after the fact. Okay, so during her visit to Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, Kamala Harris announced two things that they were promoting. The first was the launch of this first ever, and you'll see this on the screen if you're watching this by video, National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. And I'm going to switch to that website here momentarily and talk about what they think is the process for the implementation of these extreme risk protection orders. Okay. And you were going to say something.
Yeah, we're talking about what we're concerned about, these due process rights that are being deprived. And how they're being deprived is, it depends on the state, but it could be a police officer that comes in. It could be a mental health counselor. It could be a disgruntled ex-wife. Okay. It could be your disgruntled employee. People can come in and make allegations about you being a dangerous person. And then those rights are taken away. Your rights are taken away from you before there's any due process. Okay. In this country, before we take away rights, we want to have due process. And for instance, in Indiana, if certain allegations are made against you, your rights can be taken away for 14 days before there's a hearing, is what it amounts to in Indiana. And honestly, you're not going to have enough time to get an attorney and effectively respond to the actions of the government against you within that 14 days. So you're going to have even longer than 14 days where you're deprived of your property.
Yeah. And you'll notice here in the White House fact sheet, the Resource Center is funded by the Department of Justice, and it's made possible. It is run by Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. So,
which is funded in, I'm sorry, you're going to go ahead.
Well, I'm going to switch to that website. So when I wanted to point this out, that the White House has established this resource center, but when I switch to the website, you'll notice that it's on the Johns Hopkins website, and that's why. It's run by the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, and you'll also see another familiar name there as well when I switch to to this tab. So you'll see Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. So you'll see here, this is operated by the Bloomberg School of Public Health, which, of course, for those who don't know, and you would know if you've been paying attention to Second Amendment news for very long, that Michael Bloomberg is one of the primary benefactors of the gun control movement. Okay. So here they have these resources basically to help inform states and localities about how to implement these sorts of violations of due process, essentially. Okay. But these extreme risk protection orders. So if you scroll down, you'll see about all the people who can report you, who can claim that you're an extreme risk.
We laugh, but it's not funny at all.
Yeah.
So what you see here.
So here, if you're any of these people, which is basically everyone, okay, that in existence,
or you know one of these people, get in touch with them, and they'll handle taking away somebody's rights.
Yeah, you can ask the government to take somebody's guns only. By the way, they can't take away your
chainsaw, or your car, or your knife, or any of those things.
Monomaniacally focused on guns.
Can I go and say something about this one? Just real quickly, I'm afraid we'll forget this. And I don't know the law in every state, but what's disappointing about this is that these red flag laws, they focus on the guns. People need to understand that there are other mechanisms in the law that provide for due process. And in Indiana, the input of professionals, medical, psychiatric folks, psychological folks. There are other processes that allow us to deal with purportedly dangerous people, and allows us to deal with these dangerous people in a much broader way, so that if they are in fact dangerous, we don't have to worry about them. I saw yesterday or the day before, somebody drove a semi truck into the CDL branch of, it may have been in Texas, okay? But it allows us to put them in a situation where they can't be dangerous in all kinds of ways, not just taking away their firearms.
Yeah, and a lot of people know those as Baker Act orders. That's what it was passed as in Florida. But they're mental health commitment orders. That's the more generic term for these processes nationwide, and every state has one. And like you said, they don't focus on just the gun. If somebody is a real risk to themselves or others, there's a process with lots of due process built in, lots of those components that you talked about, Mike, earlier in the show, built into the process. And there's even a right to counsel, appointed counsel, if somebody can't afford one, it built into that process.
And so they can be helped as well, is and I'm not an expert on those things, but so they can also be given mental health counseling or help as well if it's needed.
Yeah.
So my point is, there's already a mechanism in the law, but these politicians want to pick out guns because that's a politically astute thing to do for them. And after all, it's not Kamala Harris's money. It's your money. You're going in debt to the Chinese.
Yeah. So why not buy some votes with your money, right? With somebody else's money.
Buy some votes. That's what they do.
So this is at erpo.org, this John Hopkins Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. And if you scroll down on the main page, you'll see they have an ERPO process. And number one, we'll just walk through this here.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
No, you're fine.
But there's 21, 22 states. Every state is going to be completely different. And for instance, Indiana is Indiana's different than Connecticut, different than Washington, whatever. So this is a more generic process that we're going to be talking about here. But one thing you're going to see when we get to number 4 step is pretty consistent across all the states.
Nothing here is the law. This is simply a resource center to help encourage politicians and states to pass these red flag laws nationwide. So it's just a model, basically, that they're laying out here. But number 1 says the petitioner files a temporary ERPO petition under penalty of perjury. Many ERPO laws also prescribe criminal penalties for presenting false information to the court. Okay, so somebody, if that's a family member, a law enforcement officer, attorney, medical professional, whoever it is, makes some report that they believe somebody is a danger to themselves or others.
Yeah, okay. And right now, as far as I know, it takes some effort to do that. One of my concerns is that the federal government, with their $750 million, will make this 2 or 3 keystrokes away, so that your ex-spouse who is not happy with you because you didn't do something, can just get online and do a few little things, and all of a sudden we're on our way to depriving you of your rights because you didn't bring over Johnny pursuant to the child support.
Well, and this, by the way, has been abused on lots of occasions, and it's hard to prove that somebody lied, okay, or made a false petition.
Yeah.
But these have been abused, and there are lots of occasions, especially in domestic violence situations, or alleged domestic violence situations, where somebody will say, this person's crazy, I think they're a danger to themselves or to me, I need you to take away their guns. And then the person that makes the allegation is the one who actually commits the violence. And there are lots of occasions where that happens. But number 2, a judicial officer approves or rejects the ERPO petition. Those are almost always approved, and very rarely turned down.
Yeah, and why are they approved? Because it's pretty easy for most judges not to worry about the 5th Amendment or the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That's not a big deal. You don't see that on Facebook when it comes election time. So they weigh that against, there might be a 1 in a million chance, but I'll take this guy's guns away and look like I'm concerned with and talk about public safety, and I'll get some votes.
There's no risk to them by taking away somebody else's guns.
Yeah.
It's not their guns that are getting taken
The judge
away.
still has his or her guns.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he has his or her gun in the courtroom.
Yeah, exactly. But I can take away this guy's, and it's politically safer for me to do that.
Yeah, and I can get out and talk about safety and being a hero and yada, yada, yada.
Number 3, if the court issues the order, law enforcement serves the order and related information on the respondent. Ideally, firearms are removed or surrendered at that time. So here, the firearms are taken away, okay, before a hearing.
We're going to get to due process. It's the next step. It'll come up here. We'll deal with the Constitution in a little bit.
Yeah.
First, we're going to take your stuff away, though.
Yeah. And the ERPO is entered by the law enforcement agency into the background check system to prohibit gun purchases for the duration of the order. All right, that's number 3. Number 4, an ERPO hearing is held.
Now we're going to do some due process, and we're going to make sure that these government officials think they've done the right thing previously.
Yep. Exactly.
All right. What do you think they're going to decide?
Mm-hmm.
That they're screwed up and they really made a mistake and we're sorry about that and violating your rights? Yeah. No, that's not what they're going to do.
Yeah. The respondent and petitioner both attend the hearing, and both may testify and present evidence. The respondent is afforded the right to counsel at these hearings, and in parentheses, at their own expense, in parentheses. Upon hearing from the parties and reviewing the evidence, a judge or judicial officer determines whether the legal burden of proof has been met and if there is sufficient evidence to issue the extreme risk protection order. So, like you said, Mike, number 4, step in the process. Finally, there's some due process. But at the respondent's expense, they have to get back their rights, essentially. Okay. So they have to present themselves at a hearing. They have to hire an attorney. They have to maybe get witnesses, evidence, medical reports, all these things to get back their firearms.
Which is all really expensive. And like I said, in Indiana, you're not going to get it done in 14 days. Get prepared for a hearing. And in all due respect, the statute, at least in Indiana, the statute says that it's the state's burden to show by clearing convincing evidence that you're a dangerous person and shouldn't have these firearms. But that's what the statute says. But you've got a government prosecutor making arguments to a government judge that in all likelihood, a government law enforcement officer or cop did the right thing. To me, I've always been amazed about how that seems fair. We've got all these government officials deciding whether what the government did was fair or not to you as a private citizen. To me, it's sort of stacked against you.
Yeah, exactly. So number 4, we finally get some due process. And if you have a judge that actually cares about the Constitution, that actually holds the state to their burden of proof, clear and convincing evidence, and the person who made the petition doesn't have good evidence, you may in fact get your firearms back after this hearing, but after huge expense. So if you don't, and oftentimes people don't, because like Mike said, the system is sort of stacked against you in this regard, you lose your firearms, and only your firearms, by the way, again, for up to 1 year before the state has to reapply essentially for this extreme risk protection order.
And it's not a year in all states. In Indiana, it's 180 days, but still.
Yeah, this is the model.
Yeah, this is the model.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know why more people aren't concerned about this process. I think primarily because most people don't know how it works. It's sort of weird. It's one of the few processes where there is no due process up front, and it's kind of a weird process. And most people, like I said, don't know about it when they hear red flag law or extreme risk protection order. It sounds good. It sounds nice, like most government programs, but it's not.
Yeah, and it's like I said, the due process. I mean, and even in this webpage they have here, I mean, they talk about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act requires due process. The problem is the due process comes after the deprivation of the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's no matter how much due process is provided. I mean, that's what Indiana always says. We have included so many due process protections in our red flag law in Indiana, but no matter what and no matter where, it is always after the deprivation, which is exactly backwards.
Exactly backwards.
And here you'll see step number 6 at the termination or expiration of the order, if renewal has not been requested, and if the respondent has not otherwise been prohibited, the firearms are returned and the background check system is updated. So there you go. That's the model that the White House has in mind, and that's available, publicly available here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health website at erpo.org. The other thing, go ahead. The other thing here, not only has the White House announced this resource center, the second thing that Kamala Harris announced at this speech at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School is calling on states to pass red flag laws and to use Bipartisan Safer Communities Act funding to help implement laws already enacted. So even if you're a state like Indiana that already has a red flag law, they want you to take federal funding to utilize your law, to implement it, to take away people's firearms and make them jump through a bunch of hoops to get their firearms back.
Yeah, and then your your state politician, your governor, and then the governor passes it on to local politicians. What are they all inclined to do? Well, they want to take this money, because when they get money, what does that convert to? We can show the voters out there, we can buy their votes. We can say, hey, we've spent this money, we got this grant.
To make you safer.
To make you safer. Meanwhile, of course, this is amazing. Local Republican politicians do this. Amazing the contribution they make to national debt by accepting all this grant money, and they're burdening their, my kids and my grandkids. But that's what happens. These local politicians, state politicians want this money because this is how they buy votes and get elected.
Yeah. So here's this resource center, and then secondly, here's a bunch of money, bribery basically, to get you to implement these deprivations of due process.
Yep.
And violations of the Constitution and individual liberty, all in the name of bipartisan safer communities. And notice there, it was bipartisan. We talked about this being a Republican and a Democratic issue. But the other thing here, too, that we talked about pre-show, you'll notice the Biden-Harris administration made $750 million in federal funding available to implement these programs. So $750 million that the Biden-Harris administration made available. Well, it's not the Biden-Harris administration's money, right? I mean, that money comes from somewhere, and that's through tax theft, essentially. Okay. So it's our money that they're using against us. That's exactly what's going on here. And it's money we don't have, by the way. Yep. We talked about this a little bit pre-show. Here's the U.S. debt clock at usdebtclock.org. You can see it rising rapidly. It's now, as we're talking here on Sunday morning, April 14th, $34 trillion. Over
34.653 trillion.
Closer to 35 trillion than 34 trillion at this point, and it's rising rapidly.
And tomorrow is April 15th. So when you send that check off, if you haven't already, or if you're one of those people who get a refund, we can talk about that later. But
so when you hear Biden talking about greedy corporations and price gouging, and that's the reason for a high price of groceries and gas, that's the opposite of the truth. It's because through monetary policy, through fiscal policy, they've ruined the value of the dollar. And here you can watch that happen here. And it's rather depressing. I recommend that you don't watch this for too long, but keep it in the back of your mind. Okay. So I'll stop sharing that for now. So that's the two things that she announced at this press conference, at this speech at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, is this resource center and this funding that they want to use to encourage states and politicians to implement these red flag laws. Go ahead.
So the government is going to steal your money to deprive you of rights. The positive spin on that is Kamala Harris is in charge, and it'll probably fail.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it's to do nothing. These red flag laws would have done nothing to prevent the massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, or I won't say any other. They may prevent some event somewhere, but they are not effective. The data to show states with these laws compared to states without these laws shows that they have no effect.
Yeah, there was in the RAND Corporation, there's a RAND study, and I don't think the RAND is they're not co-authoring stuff with the Mises Institute, for instance.
Right.
But they said that the evidence was inconclusive at best when they studied these, quote, red flag laws. And I want to remind folks that, and you probably know the quote, I don't, I should, and I'm not sure who made it, but I prefer not unsafe freedom, but I prefer risky freedom over.
Oh, sure.
What's the quote?
Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson.
Yeah, I prefer the tempestuous sea of liberty to the calm sea of despotism. Something like that.
Yeah. So you can have the policy argument if you want. To me, I won't say I'm not concerned, but the liberty interests are much more important to me. And like I said, even the RAND Corporation, I think, said the evidence is inconclusive at best.
Yeah. So
I also want to point out.
Oh, go ahead. Well, so we're going to take your money spend it to take away due process and take away your firearms for nothing, except to take away your rights. That's what this is all about.
And get you to vote for folks that are scared.
Yeah. And by the way, and Mike, you mentioned this at the beginning of the show, there was a commission report, and this was a study conducted after the massacre at Parkland High School, or Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. This study looked at things like red flag laws, and guess what? It did not recommend them. Okay. So I'll link to this in the show notes as well. It's at the Florida state website, Florida Department of Law Enforcement. You can see there was lots of public input. There was a commission. They prepared an initial report and a second report. And the second report is 300 and some odd pages, I believe, 389 pages. So if you have more interest in this, I'll make that link available in the show notes as well.
But I'm sure Kamala can figure out a way to improve them so it'll work better, kind of like she did at the border.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So I'll link to all this. This is really, I think, concerning. If your state does not have a red flag law, make sure that you stay in touch with your representatives to keep it that way. And of course, if you're in a state like Indiana, do whatever you can to get rid of them, because at its core, it's a law to take away a fundamental individual right before due process. Okay. And that's exactly the opposite of what our founders envisioned. That's exactly the opposite of what freedom and liberty require.
And from a policy standpoint, the evidence is inconclusive that they do anything. And I want to point out, I've got a note here from our previous episode that I think's a good, that always concerns me, because whenever there's a murder, people do Monday morning quarterbacking and say, "Oh, there were all these signs." And I think that's illegitimate. Here's why. We had noted this as the oddball problem previously. There's a gentleman by the name of Jacob Sullum, Sullum. He wrote a column for Reason, and he questioned the concept of red flag laws and whether or not these, quote, experts, end quote, can distinguish between what's really harmless oddballs, just weirdos, weird people, different people, and future murderers. And he cited a 2012 Department of Defense study that stated, even if red flag laws are common, or even if red flags are common among mass murderers, almost none of the people who display those signs are bent on murderous violence. So even if someone, quote, failed, end quote, some of these red flag screenings that these experts do, there's like a 99.5% chance that they're not somebody that's going to commit a murder or a violent act. So in other words, you're going to start screening all of these people who, there's absolutely an incredibly remote chance that they're going to do anything violent.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's where we'll leave it for now, Mike, unless you have something else that you want to mention before we close up the show. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Probably, but after the show's over, we'll.
But this, like I said, I'll link to all this in the show notes. I'll also link to an AmmoLand article that I thought was worthwhile as well about this issue. And also a link to a 9-minute video from a father of a student who was killed at Parkland, and how he was upset. He was very frustrated that Kamala Harris used the death of his child for a photo op, for an opportunity to promote gun control. And so he basically says, quit using my child for a photo op. So I'll link to that as well. I think his commentary is very compelling. All right, so that's where we'll leave it. I want to read this quote one more time from John Milton. Nations grown corrupt love bondage more than liberty. And that's exactly what we see here. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned a little something about these emergency risk protection orders and so-called red flag laws. As always, if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. You can always find us on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and all of the most popular podcast streaming platforms. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.